Now we've seen how to access elements from a list and from a string by passing in an index value into square brackets. Now while indexing is used with other data types to access values, a dictionary uses keys. Now keys can be used either inside square brackets, just like with indexing, or we can use the dictionary get method. So let's see some examples first using square brackets. If we first of all create a dictionary called names_ages and take the dictionary that we created in the last video of names and ages, we can first of all stipulate our names_ages variable, which we know is a dictionary object. We can then place square brackets after the variable name, and inside the square brackets we pass the key. So let's obtain the age of Jane. We can pass Jane inside square brackets, and when we run this code, we return 24. Now we could copy and paste this code and then place Kim inside square brackets. When we run this code, we obtain the value 52. So we can simply take a key, place it inside the square brackets to obtain the associated value. Now if we were to place a value inside square brackets that does not exist as a key in the dictionary, we get a key error when we run the code. For example, if I were to pass the key Simon into square brackets, we run into a key error. Now the second way we can obtain a value from a dictionary is by using the get method. So using the same syntax that we've seen when using methods on other data structures like lists, we can use dot notation. So we can type names_ages and then we can place a dot. We can then use the get method and then we can open up parentheses. Inside these parentheses, we need to stipulate the key that we're searching for. So if I were to put Sam inside the parentheses, we obtain the value 32. If I were to copy this code and then place Jane inside the parentheses, we get back 24. Now the difference between the get method and the square bracket syntax to access a value from a dictionary is with respect to the case where a key is not found. So if I were to type names_ages.get and then place Simon inside the parentheses, you can see that nothing is returned. In other words, the get method returns none if the key is not found. So we don't run into the same key error message when a key does not exist. So here we've seen two ways of being able to access elements from a dictionary. We can use square brackets and pass in a key. If the key doesn't exist, we'll run into a key error. The second method is by using the get method on the dictionary object. So we can place the variable name, .get, and then inside parentheses, pass the key name. If the key doesn't exist, the method will return none. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the container known as default dict. And once again, the default dict container is also a subclass to the dictionary. So how is the default dict container useful? Well, it's used to provide some default values for the key if ever the key you're trying to access doesn't exist, and it would never then raise a key error, which may be something you want your program to achieve depending on the project you're working on. So the way we create a default dict object is by creating an instance of the default dict class, just like we've seen in the prior two examples. But this time, we need to pass in the data type that we want to use in our default dictionary as an argument. So let me show you what I mean by this. So if we first of all import default dict, so we can put from collections import default dict, and then set a variable equal to dd, and we'll set this equal to default dict, and then open parentheses. Let's suppose that we want the values in this default dictionary to be integers. So if I pass in the keyword int into parentheses, this means we're passing in the data type integer, and we would expect our values to be of the integer data type. So we can now create a variable called nums, and we'll just set this equal to an iterable. So we'll create a list and we'll pass in some random numbers. So we'll put 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 4, 1 and 2. We'll now simply iterate through these numbers to create the count and store the count of these numbers as values. So if I put for I in nums, then put a colon, I can then put dd, open square brackets, and then take each value for I on each iteration, and then I'll simply increment this value by 1. So if I now print out what's stored in dd, you can see that we print out a default dict object. It tells us that the value types are integers, and if we look at the dictionary, you can see that we have 1 counted 2 times, 2 is counted 3 times, 3 has a value of 1, and 4 has a value of 2. Now I mentioned earlier that there are default values provided for a key if that key does not exist, and it wouldn't then raise a key error. So let's see this in action. If I try to print out the value associated with key 1, so if I print dd, open square brackets, and pass in 1, you can see that we print 2 to the screen. And that's because we have the value 2 associated with the key 1. But what would happen if I tried to print out dd and then try to access key 5? Well, you can see that when I run this code cell, we print 0 to the screen. And that's because the default value is 0 when we pass an int to the default dict class. So we don't have to worry about running into a key error here, even though we know 5 doesn't exist, because it will come back with 0 by default. Now here we've seen an example with integers, but what would happen if we pass in a different data type? So if we create a variable called dd2 and set this equal to default dict and in parentheses pass in list. If we now put for I in nums, so we'll still be working with our nums variable, which has those numbers we put in earlier, then put a colon, I can then access the key, so if I put dd2 and then pass into square brackets value I, this will be accessing each element in the numbers variable. And then if we put dot append and then brackets I, this will then append the number to a list. Now this might sound confusing, but let's just see it in action. If I print to the screen now what's stored in dd2 when we run this code cell, you can see that we're once again presented with a default dict, which is now going to contain values that are hosted as lists. And you can see here that key 1 now has a list as the value, and the list has 2 elements with 1 written twice. So you can see in this for loop, it's first of all looped over the value 1 in nums, and therefore accessed the key 1. And because we're utilizing a list as the data type passed into the default dict, we're able to append I, which is that value 1, every time it's observed. So because 1 is in the list twice, we have 2 i's appended to a list, which is then the value associated with key 1. What happens if we try to access key 2? Well, if we print dd2, open square brackets, and pass in 2, we get the list with 3 2's associated with it. And if I print out dd2 and pass in the key 5, which we know doesn't exist, we end up returning an empty list. So once again, we don't run into a key error, we simply return an empty list. And this may be the behavior you want to implement in your application or project. In the next video, our next container we're going to take a look at is known as chain map. So I'll see you in the next video.